I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. Will, first episode in a few weeks. We've been weekly for going on 3 years now here. The magazine took a little bit out of us. We both needed a break. You were out of town. I'm out of town next week. We're gonna pump the brakes a little bit here over the summer and just gear up for football season. We'll be back at it full bore in August, but I think we both agreed that through July we're gonna try to do episodes when we can, type of thing. But hey, right now we did want to get an episode in. We had some time this week. Uh, Gator baseball's made a heck of a run. That's been a lot of fun to watch. We'll compare a little bit of that with what could happen with the football team this year at the end of the episode. But we're going to start this episode off talking about the magazine. The magazine, we've received tremendous support from it. We wanted to say thank you to everybody if you purchased a copy from us. We really, really appreciate the support. But one of the most exciting things to come from this time, I mean, we do appreciate the support. We'll talk about that in a minute here, but Will actually got the opportunity to go on the Paul Finebaum Show on the SEC Network a couple of weeks ago. Will, how was that experience, man? What was that like? Tell people how that worked from start to finish. I'm sure people are interested and want to know.
I mean, it's pretty nerve-wracking, and it's a professional organization over there. So you've got somebody in your ear sort of telling you what to do, and hey, we're going to be on in 5 seconds and all that sort of stuff. Felt like I was really on TV, and I was. Obviously, it's a live broadcast on TV, which is a little bit nerve-wracking, and it was hilarious too because my kid, his 12U baseball team was playing for a championship that night. So I'm not sure whether I was nervous because of going on the Finebaum Show or whether I was nervous because of the championship baseball game. But he pulled home the chip too. He closed that one out. So it was
That's
it
great.
was a good day for everybody. But look, I mean, obviously we couldn't be there. I wouldn't be on Paul Finebaum without all the support we've gotten from the various people who've encouraged us, who've bought the magazine, who've told us that what we're doing they think is valuable, who've read the website, all that sort of stuff. And I couldn't be more thankful to all the people who sort of keep us going and have given us positive reviews. And it's a cool experience to have somebody reach out to you and validate that what you're doing is valuable and that what you're doing is worth putting on ESPN or SEC Network. So, certainly one of those benchmarks that when you're a little kid, you go, oh, if I was going to get into this space, I'd want to be on ESPN, and I can put a check mark next to that. And that's pretty cool. But I'm humble enough, hopefully, to understand that the reason that happens is because of all the support that we've gotten from people back when Little Read and Reaction started. And the first article I put out, 250 people read it or something like that. And, I had 6 people to my mailing list and have built it up now to where large entities like that are interested. And that's a really cool thing, but I think it's a testament to Gator Nation. I think it's a testament to the people specifically who've supported Read and Reaction, have reached out to us and told us that what we do is valuable to them. So thank you to you all, because this is all part, you're all part of it. And hopefully you feel that way and understand that we wouldn't be where we are. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if it hadn't been for them.
Yeah, and we appreciate we've received great support from our friends in this space too. Gator Dave, obviously first and foremost, he's been a great friend to the show and great friend to each of us. Uh, SEC Mike, that SEC podcast did a great job promoting the magazine. The High Top guys, love those guys. Shelton, Dave, they have such a blast on that show. And really, Will, few others if you want to give a shout out. And I know you've made the circuit. You've done great. I know you're on Shane Matthews as well. So we appreciate him having Will on Pot Up in the morning. So we just want to give a shout out to some of these shows too that have had us had Will on, had myself on to promote the magazine a little bit too.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, obviously, Gator Dave, he's a great friend beyond just being a Gator colleague. So it's awesome to have him supporting us. He advertised in the magazine and had us on there. Ali Peak has had us on. Shane Matthews, like you mentioned, the High Top guys. SEC Mike has been one of the most supportive people that you can imagine in this space. And Nick Delatorre is somebody that we offered to send a magazine. And he said, "No, I want to buy it." And that kind
Yeah,
of thing is
very
rare in
nice.
this industry, and that's really cool. So, I think I'm probably missing somebody. I apologize if I am.
1010XL in Jacksonville. I'll
Ah, yeah,
scout
yeah,
those
yeah.
guys
We
out.
got.
Right.
Sorry, we got Hacker went on there with Ryan Green there on 1010XL,
Dan
and then
Hicken.
Dan Hicken as well.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, like just like Finebaum and maybe even more than Finebaum, those guys have their hand on the pulse of Gator Nation. They see value in this sort of magazine, and their fans see value in it too. Um, so it's just been an awesome sort. It's been exhausting, but it's been an awesome ride to go out there and be on all these shows and be able to push forward something that we thought was a really awesome Father's Day gift, and that's something that we were pushing. Hopefully, a bunch of people gave it to their dad this week. We'd love to hear from you if you gave it to your dad and what his reaction was and whether he liked it. And then, look, 4th of July is coming up. A bunch of people are taking time off this summer. It's an awesome beach read. It's one of those things that, we've divided it up into different articles. And so, it's not like a novel where you got to remember where you left off. It's, oh yeah, I want to read about the defense today, and
Yeah.
I'll flip to the back. Oh, I want to read about quarterbacks. I'll flip there. Oh, I have my phone so I can read in a QR code and sit there and look at the actual film while I'm sitting on a deck, and there's some shade so I can see on my iPad or something like that what's actually happening in the play as the diagram sitting there on the page. There's some really cool stuff in there. We think some stuff that's really going to prepare you for the season, and certainly, we've had a bunch of people leave reviews on Amazon, and I would say that the most used word in those things is in depth. Like that's the thing that I'm proud of from those reviews, is that people seem to have gotten value from it, but they've also said it's an in-depth magazine. It's in-depth articles. You're going to learn something. They're using unique data sets, in-depth review of plays, um, you know, exceptional read for any Gators fan, unparalleled insight into the team's performance and strategies. Those are the sorts of things that we try to do on the website on a week to week basis. But obviously the magazine is a big part of the magazine's a big part of that as well. So if you've already purchased it, thank you so much. If you haven't, you can go to readreaction.com/mag, pick up a copy. And if you have already purchased it and you enjoyed it, please forward the link to some of your friends. Like you probably know just as many Gators as we do. Get it out there. If you think they'd enjoy it, if you think somebody'd want it for 4th of July, send it their way. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but putting it in front of them would be a huge favor to us.
Well, I don't love talking about us because we'll get boring at some point here. But I wanted to start off the show with that to really show like, hey, we try to do this week to week because we want to bring everybody our thoughts on what's going on with Gator Nation here. But it's not like we've been up to nothing here the last few weeks, so we have
Well, that's
stayed
cool.
busy.
One of my buddies from college, I sent him a still shot from the Finebaum show.
Yeah.
And after he like picked himself off the floor, because he's like, no way, because we talked about that when we were in college. And then he sent me back a screenshot where he had like put it as my background for like Microsoft Teams. He's like, you got to have that at work. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. But again, like I said, I mean, this doesn't happen without the people who are the fans, the people
Yeah.
who support us, the people who've bought the magazine, and honestly, the people who forwarded any article or YouTube link that we've ever put out there to their buddy and said, hey, there's something interesting in here. So thank you so much for the people who've done that. And if you haven't, forward this one, please, because we can still use a bigger audience. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, well, hey, we'll start diving into some Gator football here. Will, you got an article coming out on Thursday. This will probably post your article will probably post before this show is actually released here. But can Austin Armstrong turn the Gators defense around? And I know, Will, this is a topic you have covered extensively this offseason. You had a great piece in the magazine about Roberts and how he factors in as well. But what's the angle on this article versus some of the other pieces you've written about
Yeah,
so
so
far?
the angle on this one is that Austin Armstrong, I didn't like the hire last year because he gave up a ton of explosive plays at Southern Miss.
Mm.
That continued at Florida last year, but one of the things that really flummoxed me, and we have a big piece in the magazine about it, is that the success rate of the Florida defense was actually pretty good. Good enough that you would have expected them to be like 25th, 30th, 35th maybe in the country in yards per play allowed. Instead, they're in the 120s when you look at those sort of statistics. So I wanted to say, well, why is that? Like, what is it that's really differentiating them from those other programs? And I went into it thinking it's going to be he's just reckless. He blitzes too much. But it turns out that explosive plays and blitz rate don't correlate at all. But for some reason, Florida is like not in the pack at all when it comes to that. And the thing that's really driving the difference for Florida, at least last year, was their inability to stop explosives in the run game. And that's funny because you think about Jalen Kimber getting burned, you think about Jaden Hill getting burned, you think about Marshall getting burned on the outside, especially in that game against, what was it, Arkansas, where he sort of got his face mask grabbed, but then it looked like a relatively lackluster effort. And you go, like the corners aren't very good. And that's true in some extent. It's not like they were great at preventing explosives through the air, but they were terrible at preventing explosives on the ground. And there's some real reasons for it. If you start looking at, it's a great stat from Sports Info Solutions. They've given us some access to some of their data. If you look at essentially broken tackles and missed tackles, the percentage, Florida's cornerbacks missed 20.4% of their tackles compared to Alabama at 13 and Georgia at 9. Florida's linebackers missed 16% of their tackles compared to 11 for Alabama and 11 for Georgia. Their safeties missed 20% of their tackles compared to 14% for Alabama and 8% for Georgia. So there's a little bit of variability in the defensive line. And I think everybody's looking at Joey Slackman and some other guys up front to really bring, oh, it's a trenches league and that sort of stuff. But the reality is you start looking at Florida and where the problems lied. It was Miguel Mitchell had 25% broken tackles plus missed tackles percent. So every time he went to make a tackle, 1 out of 4 times he missed it. Jaden Hill was at 22.2, Jalen Kimber 21.9, Scooby Williams 20.9, Princely Human Meelan 16, Manny Nunnery 14.7. And in their place are guys like Asa Turner at 6.9, Triquez Bridges at 12.5, and Pup Howard, who had 0%, 0 broken tackles. Now, that was in 97 snaps, but 0 broken tackles. So if those guys can replicate those performances, I've been talking all year or all offseason about how the safety play for Florida was bad last year. And I haven't really dived into the PFF rankings and how it's divided up. I've just looked at the overall rankings, but I suspect if I go look at those rankings that Florida's corners and safeties their rankings are going to be drugged down significantly by their play in the running game, because all I see when I look at these stats is giant plays because corners are missing tackles. And you don't have to go to the film very long to look for that. I mean, just go watch the Kentucky game and
it's
you'll
like
immediately see that.
you can go back to our takes after the Georgia game last year too, and I think the big takeaway that each of us had coming away from that game was you watch those Georgia defensive backs, they step up, they're making clean tackles for the most part, and that just that did not happen on our side of the ball for a good chunk of last year. So it's interesting to see that, hey, it's not just something you think you're seeing. The numbers are actually backing that up to a pretty significant extent.
Well, I mean, here's the deal. Florida had 9 players who made at least 5 tackles last year with a block tackle missed tackle percentage or a broken tackle missed tackle percentage north of 15%. Alabama had 3, Georgia had 3. And the Gators had 6 players above 20%. Alabama had 1, Georgia had 0. So you can talk about talent discrepancies all you want, but some of that is toughness, some of that is coaching. And I think one of the reasons why Ron Roberts is in Gainesville is to fix the coaching part. They've also replaced their strength and conditioning program. So toughness and coaching should improve. That success rate at 38%, if they can maintain that while getting better at tackling on the back end, if those explosives in the run game go away, they will end just if all they do is eliminate the explosives in the run game. They can have the exact same pass defense that they had last year, and they will come back to the pack as an average SEC defense. Now, look, average isn't the Florida standard, and we'd like to see much, much better than that. But people keep saying, and they're right, because last year I was like, oh, the defense can't be worse than it was in 2022. And in some ways it was, but there's a lot of underlying stats and a lot of reasons why the 2023 defense was worse. And that didn't make it any easier to watch. But I think there are some concrete steps and really, quite honestly, personnel changes that are going to make this defense better this year. The question now is how much better? And is it going to be enough given the schedule and given some of the talent discrepancies that Florida's going to have, especially late in the season?
I'm just having Kentucky flashbacks while we're talking about all that. Just Ray Davis just keeps running in my mind here. So
He still hadn't stopped,
hopefully,
buddy.
hopefully we can figure that out. Hey, we knocked him out of baseball, right? Get a little bit of. It's nice to beat Kentucky. We haven't felt that in a little bit, man. It's nice to beat those Wildcats. Just out of curiosity on those numbers, who was the highest percentage?
Who was the highest for Florida?
Yeah,
Oh, it was Miguel Mitchell at 25%.
he was the highest. Okay,
Yeah.
you mentioned his stat. I didn't hear that it was the highest. Okay.
Yeah. He was definitely the highest. And obviously obviously he's no longer in Gainesville. And a bunch of those guys that I listed were people who aren't with the program anymore. Right. I think the only guy who was up above 16 or 17% was Jordan Castell. And so that really, to me, needs to be the area of emphasis for Castell. But if Castell can fix that and get that down in like the 11 or 12% range, now you're talking about a guy who's got good coverage skills, played a year in the SEC. Now he's bringing the guys down when he gets them in space. And you're talking about a potential all SEC safety if he can fix that. Now, look, going from 18% to 11% ain't nothing. Like that's real progress, but you figure a true freshman coming in, probably not the strongest guy out there, going to wear down throughout the season, going to struggle against some of the big backs and against some of the tight ends. And we saw it Missouri specifically. There are a couple of plays that jumped to mind where he could have come up and made a tackle on a crossing route, missed it, and it turned into a big play. And those are pass plays, obviously, but to me, this is a huge area of development for Castell. And if he takes that step forward, along with the guys they brought in, then Florida's going to be in a really good spot.
Well, and I know one thing you've harped on too this offseason is the linebacker play. So if the linebacker play picks up, you would assume the safeties are put in better position to make tackles and probably will have a little bit of a cleaner look at guys. So like, yeah,
Well, let's be honest. We could harp on anything for defensive play
I don't know. Right?
from from last year.
What's
So
been my
I don't know
rule?
that you need to give me.
My rule all offseason has been don't say it can get worse. Don't stop saying it can't get worse. We've seen it the last few years. It can get worse. But
But the cool part about this article, at least to me, is this now gives us a way to talk about through the year how it like why it's bad. Right. I think we've identified some stuff that tells us why it's bad and what happened last year. And is that 38% success rate an outlier, or is it something that is, is it an outlier, or is it an indication that there was a lot of weird stuff that went on and Florida's defense should have been better? I honestly don't know the answer to that question right now. I just don't. I don't know whether Florida happened to get lucky from a success perspective and was just terrible on the back end because the defensive coordinator isn't very good, or is the defensive coordinator a significant upgrade over Patrick Toney, but there was some weird stuff going on in the back end that drove Florida's defense to put up, from a counting statistics perspective, just a terrible year. I don't know the answer to that, but I think 3 or 4 games into this year, we'll be able to look at some of these stats like the broken tackle plus missed tackle percentage, like success rate, like explosivity, and start to say, hey, like this has come back to the pack over the first four games. And so we should expect that going forward. And that'll give us either more confidence or less confidence heading into that last 5 game stretch to end the season.
well, hey, you got more experienced players coming back. You got some transfer portal guys coming in. This defense is definitely more experienced and in better shape than it has been in a few years on paper. But we'll see how that looks on the field on August 31st. Let's jump forward. One of those new guys is transfer Joey Slackman from your neck of the woods there. Willie's up, he was at UPenn the last several years, enters the transfer portal, one of the top guys coming out of the Ivy Leagues. Uh, in the article is by Bruce Feldman, went into detail about how he was really taken aback by the recruiting process. He had a lot of interest from top schools. I saw his name early on. I would think he would have had some kind of idea because he was getting looks from the NFL. It sounded like they projected him in the late rounds. But obviously, coming to a school like Florida, I think he looked at Wisconsin and a few other big schools as well. You get the chance to raise your profile with a week-to-week basis here. But the big thing I got from the article, Will, is he has a really interesting background with wrestling, and I know you had something to add to that with the wrestling component.
Yeah, so there were a couple of things I took from the article. The first one was that he was recovering from a torn bicep, so surgery for a torn bicep, when all of a sudden he entered the transfer portal. It just so happened that those two things coincided, that he entered the transfer portal at the same time that he was recovering from a torn bicep. One of the things that I noted during the spring game is that he was not listed amongst the starters, but that maybe gives you a little bit better that gives you a little bit better idea of why, right? That's
Mhm.
probably about a 6 month injury recovery time. And so I'm assuming he hadn't had a whole lot of time to really get in there and prove what he could do um, early on during spring practice. So we'll see whether he can jump up into that starting lineup um, come come fall practice. And then the second part is that the wrestling part really is interesting, and interesting to me for a personal reason. So there's a guy named Nick Hardwick who played 10 seasons for the Chargers, made the Pro Bowl one year, and was a high school baseball teammate of mine and was a wrestler. And Nick was a guy who wrestling was his main deal. And he sort of played baseball. You know, he was a good player, but he wasn't the best player on the team. But he was maybe, I don't know, 170, 180 pounds soaking wet. And you don't think of that guy as a all pro or pro bowl NFL center when a guy graduates from high school in that general in that general size frame. I don't even know if he played high school football. I don't think he did when I was there. I'm not necessarily like we weren't close or anything like that. We were just teammates. But the interesting thing is he bulked up to like 300 pounds, wound up trying out for wound up walking on at Purdue, became a starting center, and then, like I said, played 10 years for the San Diego Chargers. I think he's still out in San Diego doing play-by-play and game analysis for the Chargers. Um, you know, 10 years in the NFL for a guy like that. So my point is that this is a center position, but it's all about leverage and it's all about hand position, which is what wrestling is about too. And that was one of the things that Slackman said in the article, is that being a defensive tackle is all about hand position, hand fighting, and leverage. And that it just immediately made me think of Nick Hardwick when he said that, because that was the thing, right? Is this is a strong guy who's been wrestling forever, and he puts on the weight, and all of a sudden now he's an elite football player, which is exactly what happened to Slackman, and one of the reasons why he was at Penn in the first place and not a highly recruited player. Now he's held on to that weight for a long time. Like he was, I think, like 280, 290 pounds in high school. Whereas I think I think Nick had to put on a bunch of weight before he went to the pros. It's actually a really cool story. If you Google him, you'll see pictures of him skinny now because he lost all the weight the minute he retired. So that wrestling discipline did not leave him as he went to the NFL. I'll tell you that much, because he was like right back down to 190, 200 pounds right after he retired. So kind of a cool connection there when it comes to wrestling and offensive and defensive line.
Yeah, great cross training, wrestling and playing either side of the line in football. So it'll be interesting to see how Slackman does this year. Obviously, it's a guy. It's also a guy that they're excited about. They mentioned in an article too, where one of Napier's quotes about Slackman throughout the spring was, "Yeah, about 12 guys came up to me after he visited and said we got to get this guy." So it seemed like he's a natural fit within the group as well, in terms of mentality and approach to the game. So it'll be good to have that leadership from an older player that guys seem to gravitate to, without barely knowing the guy. It sounded like Will.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Ivy League is the Ivy League, and we're going to have to see that transfer over to the SEC. But at the same time, domination is domination. And if you had a guy who was dominating in high school, you don't sit there and go, well, it's not the SEC. How is it going to transfer? You go, does he have the size? Does he have the speed? Does he have the
Hmm.
skill? And if he does, then hey, we think that's going to transfer. Now, Florida does have some limitations in terms of timing, right? It can't take him 3 years to develop. He doesn't have 3 years of eligibility left, so he's got to be able to make that jump quickly. But like I said, I think the injury probably is something that I hadn't necessarily heard before this article, and I suspect probably slowed him down a little bit in the spring. So we're really interested to see what kind of steps he takes forward in the fall, because as much as we got excited about Caleb Bex and Cam Jackson, their on-off numbers, again, Sports Info Solutions did a really has a really nice, a really cool feature to get on-off numbers for Cam Jackson specifically. His on-off numbers last year weren't very good, and it does have me wondering:
Now
is
for
that
those who
is
don't follow the analytics on off numbers, you define that for people.
yeah, sorry. So when he's on the field, so the way Sports Info Solutions does is they look at EPA against, right? So expected points added against when he's on the field and when he's off the field. And
Mhm.
Florida was actually a better defense last year when Cam Jackson was off the field. Now, this is sort of like there's 11 guys on the field, right? And so when you're starting against better teams, or if you're injured and you miss a game against Charlotte, or say they held you out against Charlotte, can skew those numbers. So I don't think it's the be all end all, but I do think that it's a curiosity when you start looking at it that Florida's starting defensive tackles were not as the team was not as successful when they were on the field versus when some of the backups were in. And so I do think Slackman's going to get an opportunity, going to get a look, and it'll be interesting to see whether just giving those guys a blow by having even if he's not elite, giving those guys a blow by having a guy who can hold up inside on run plays or who can be next to Des Watson, and now you've got two guys who can hold up inside, and then you can bring in Jackson and Banks for more pass rush type situations where you want them to push the center back into the quarterback and create turnovers. A lot of times defensive line isn't just about what kind of play did you make. It's did you allow your big time guy to rest on the sideline so he's got his wind when it's time to make a big play on third or fourth down. So hopefully, if nothing else, Slackman can bring that to the fold.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how he fits in and how he develops throughout this season. Definitely counting on him to be somewhat of a key player, I would imagine, on that defensive front. So it'll be interesting to see how the transfer Joey Slackman does. Let's move on to our final topic of the day here. I wanted to. I've had a great time watching this Gator baseball team make this run. I'm not much of a Gator baseball fan throughout the year. I kind of keep an eye on the team, how they're doing. Obviously, Jack's been playing well all year, but the run at Stillwater was pretty amazing, considering the team barely makes the playoff or barely makes the tournament, right? The NCAA tournament. You make a great run at Stillwater, surprise everybody. You go down to Clemson for the Super Regional, get it done. And what was one of the more exciting games that I've ever watched with college baseball. And then in Omaha, still alive in Omaha. We're recording this. They get to play the A&M game here, but uh, could be a tall task to beat A&M twice, I would imagine, Will. But either way, what a run by this Gator baseball team. And it's been fun watching people just enjoy it. And I'll tell you what, Will, for people who are crushing the program, and they've had their moment the last few years here. There's been plenty to talk about. It's been a heck of a run this spring cycle here for sports. I mean, basketball had some positivity going into the postseason. You've seen softball make a run, baseball make a run. I know last year they had the golf title, the track and field. I'm not going to go too deep into everything, but there's been a lot of success. It's starting to feel like the old times a little bit, where there's a lot of Gator sports making a run here, Will. But I want to tie it into football because everyone has just talked about this schedule with the Gators, right? Baseball team had one of the toughest schedules in the country. I believe they're a game or two above 500. With our schedule here, you wrote an article a couple of weeks ago about the schedule. How what would be the football version of what the baseball team is doing right now? So what would the 2024 football team look like if they did something akin to what has happened on the baseball field the last few weeks?
Yeah, so um, right now it's 5-0 Texas A&M in the bottom of the seventh, so Florida's batting right now.
Yeah.
So it looks like the run's probably about to come over, and this is more of a post-mortem than it is, hey, we're in the final, or we're taking them on for a second game since it's a double elimination side of the bracket. What I would say um, is that it's definitely been the Caglione show all year
Mhm.
long. And there have been guys who have stepped in at different times to star, but there hasn't been a guy who's been able to step in all the time and be a star. And so I think that's maybe when you talk about what would this look like for the Florida football team, is that's more the type of thing that I'm looking for. Is it's not necessarily, you're not going to be able to do it with just Caglione or just Graham Mertz or just Trey Wilson. You're going to have a lot of guys step in. So you think about last year's baseball team with Wyatt Langford there to help Caglione and to protect Caglione. And all of a sudden, Florida's offense much, much better on the baseball side than it has been this year. Now, conversely, though, the Florida team has played a ton of tough competition, and that competition prepared them in a way where taking on Nebraska and taking on Oklahoma State and taking on Kentucky, earlier today and pounding them. But all the close games that they played and where you've got a guy like Brandon Neely who can come in and shut things down, there's a scenario, and we've talked about it all year. There's a scenario where Florida's 7-0 heading into that Georgia game. Like, it's going to take some luck. They're going to have to pull out a couple of one-score games. I mean, I'm not going to tell you they're going to be 7-0, but there's a scenario where they could be. And so to me, that's the thing is it really comes down to, you hear coaches talk about it all the time. You got to kind of learn to win. And I see this with my 12-year-old when he's out there. Like the other day, he just had a great outing when he went to pitch, and you could see him all of a sudden using his pitches in a way that he hasn't used them before. And I think you're going to see that with the Florida football team. If they can get off to a good start early, then they start to see that momentum build. And so again, maybe the comparison isn't necessarily that this is like an iron sharpens iron where Florida faces this schedule and it prepares them for later in the year. Maybe it's that early wins in the schedule can bring them some confidence in the same way that some of Florida's close wins early in the tournament brought them some confidence that then has allowed them to propel themselves all the way to what, the final six teams, final four
Well,
teams, I guess.
Final Four, right?
So look, I mean, I'm never going to say being in the Final Four is a poor season. I mean, even if this ends to Texas A&M tonight, Florida's done a really nice job of getting there, and if the football team can figure out a way to get in the Final Four next year, I think we'd all be thrilled. Nobody more than us, because it's a whole lot more fun to face a winning team or to cover a winning team than a losing team. But I do think that there's something about the confidence that you gain when you pull out a couple of close ones. And you can even use Missouri as a comp for this. Last year, they had a really close game against, I think, an FBS opponent. And then they had a walk-off field goal from their giant kicker who was able to, I mean, I think from like 50 or
Against
55 yards
Kansas
against
State.
Kansas State.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there and they're 3-0, and you're like, oh, this is kind of a cool story, but it's Mizzou. Like, they'll eventually come back to earth. And all of a sudden, Mizzou is this not even just scrappy team. All of a sudden, Mizzou's a top 10 team by the time you get to the end of the year, 11-2. I don't think Missouri is going to replicate that this year. I think Missouri is going to come back to the pack because I don't think it was sustainable. I think some of those really close wins last year are going to go away this year. However, last year they were able to ride those wins to a season that everybody definitely thinks is successful. And the question is, will Florida be able to do the same thing? And is that kind of what's happened with the Florida baseball program? And is there a comp? Maybe, but you got to get off to a good start.
My thought was there was a lot of talk about the Florida baseball team not deserving the bid. So, borderline record, but they did have that tough schedule. So it's a 12-team playoff. One of those bids is going to the conference champion from the Power Five league, or the group of five schools, right? So like your American, MAC, like those type of schools, Mountain West. They're going to get one bid. So it's really, you're fighting for the four main conference champions get a bid. There's the one group of five champions. So you're really fighting for one of six spots in that scenario there.
Welcome to the
if
Big
you're
Ten SEC Invitational.
if you go 8-4, as if the Gators go 8-4 against this schedule, 9-3, I think, is a 100% in. 8-4, I think the real answer is it depends on which 8, and it depends on how bad the 4 are. But could you make a solid argument? What's the scenario 8-4 that Florida is banging on the table for a wild card spot, essentially?
So, I mean, you can absolutely make that case. Gator Dave and I talked about this on Gators Breakdown last week, which is at 8-4, if you've beaten Miami and beaten Florida State, and those are the top two teams in the ACC, how can you get left out at that point? They can't put an ACC team other than the ACC champion in over you, right? So essentially, and I think one of the things that last year really did start to establish is we're going to look at the quality of your schedule, and we're going to look at the quality of your team at the time that it's time to select the teams that are going to go to the playoff. So last year, if Jordan Travis had been Florida State's quarterback, I don't think there's any doubt that Florida State would have made the 14 playoff. But the fact that Travis was out, they took that into account. That Florida State looked like garbage against a bunch of teams, including Florida, there towards the end of the year. And they're like, they can't beat these other teams without Jordan Travis. And so we're going to evaluate them based on that. So let's say that Graham Mertz goes down in like week 3, and I hope he doesn't, but let's say that he goes down in week 3 and Florida drops a couple of close games early on in the season. So they drop the game at Tennessee and they drop the game against Kentucky. But, they're 5-2 heading into that Georgia game. And all of a sudden they end up 8-8. All of a sudden they end up 8-4, and DJ Lagway has been playing great. And maybe they drop the game to Georgia, drop the game to Texas, and then they run the table, so they're 8-4. That's one where I sit there and I go, people should look at that and say they have a phenom quarterback who has turned into this guy. They beat At that point they would have beaten LSU, Ole Miss, and Florida State to end the year. Hopefully, if those teams are highly ranked, that's a pretty good run. All right, Lagway struggled against Georgia and Texas, but those two teams are in the playoff. Right. And you got to sort of factor in the transition from Mertz to Lagway if something were to happen early on. So that, to me, those are sort of the kinds of scenarios you'd be looking at where 8-4 would get you in. I think, like you said, 9-3, those teams have been in the top 15 pretty much ever since the playoffs, ever since they started the playoff rankings. And then it'll just be a question of, does one of them get knocked out because of sort of the weird, a Notre Dame getting incorporated in, or one of those group of 5 teams getting its way in as well. You might get knocked out there. But I joked earlier about it being the SEC Big Ten Invitational. I mean, that's what it's going to be, right? It's going to be the top 4 teams from the SEC, top 4 teams from the Big Ten, and then we fill it out with everybody else. And sort of like the College World Series, it's ACC and SEC. It's going to be Big Ten, SEC in college football, both because they're very large conferences, but also because you're always going to have high quality teams rise to the top. Um, just by virtue of anybody in any of those conferences is going to be able to say, I played a tougher schedule than Miami. I played a tougher schedule than Florida State. I played a tougher schedule than Baylor. I played a tougher schedule than Central Florida. Like you're just always going to be able to say that. And so I think there the comparison will, I think the committee is going to start honoring that, because if they don't, what you're going to get is the Citadel. Right. Like if Florida does well and doesn't get rewarded for the 2024 or 2025 season, what's the incentive to do that then?
Well,
Like, why
especially in
play?
your scenario where, the non-conference games, Miami and Florida State, if those are decent teams too, like Florida's got a tough non-conference schedule coming up in the next several years. So I'm sure there will be some adjustments if that's not rewarded.
No. And I mean, look, you get what you incentivize. And so last year they disincentivized Georgia for having just a complete cupcake schedule by leaving Georgia out. And, look, there were only 4, and I think there's justifications, obviously, since Alabama beats Georgia as the SEC champion. But I don't think any of us believe Georgia wasn't one of the best 4 teams in the country last year. Now, the fact that you and I can call them the SEC runner-up 2 out of the last 3 years is a little bit gratifying, just because we have to be petty because Florida's been so bad. But yeah, I just look at it and I say, you have told the Bulldogs that they need a tougher schedule, and they actually have one this year.
Their
And
schedule is brutal.
it
They
is.
got a tough schedule, yeah.
Well, and again, I go back to, they may be a better team this year that goes 10-2. Right now, the good news for the Bulldogs, I suppose, is that 10-2 in the SEC is still going to get you in the playoff, and we're arguing about it. Will 8-4 get you in the playoffs? So the one thing this is going to do is it's absolutely going to eliminate some of the drama for the one loss. Right, like you're going to end up with an SEC championship game with 2 teams that are going no matter what.
Right.
And that it's
But
it's
but
neither
you
good
get
nor
the
bad. It just
seed.
is.
You do get the seed though. You're playing for the seed in the bye. So you're playing to move on to the next round. So I think
We'll
that's an
see. I
interesting
mean,
part.
we'll,
And if
we'll
you
see.
lose that game, you're not guaranteed to get a home game in the second round. So it might not be, not only do you not get the bye, but then you're playing in the snow up at Penn State, in a couple weeks versus getting a bye for a few weeks and then playing at a bowl game site. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
All
think
I
there's
all I
still
know is
it'll still matter.
all I know is I froze my butt off years ago at a Cowboys Eagles game that was so cold and meant nothing in week 17. And I only went because I have friends who are Eagles fans and I got the tickets for them. So I went for the experience, and it was so cold my cell phone battery stopped working,
Yeah.
and the beer was freezing. And so we left in the third quarter, even though those folks are diehards, just because we couldn't take it anymore.
As miserable as the super hot games are, the super cold games are worse.
I'd
I,
rather
I've
be
done
hot.
I've done both. Yeah, I've sat on ice at games before. It's real tough. For those of you who don't know Georgia's schedule this year, they open with Clemson at a neutral site in Atlanta, by the way. Kirby hates those neutral site games. They always like playing in Atlanta at the beginning of the year. Tennessee Tech, at Kentucky, they go on a bye at Alabama versus Auburn versus Mississippi State at Texas, bye again versus Florida and Jacksonville, at Ole Miss, Tennessee, UMass, and then Georgia Tech. And then the SEC title game is after the Georgia Tech week. But man, that stretch will in the middle, you go from Alabama. I mean, even Kentucky, you can throw Kentucky in there too, but you go at Kentucky, a bye week in between, at Alabama, Auburn, Mississippi State, at Texas, and the bye week, Florida, at Ole Miss, and first Tennessee. I That's as tough as any stretch in the country right there.
Yep.
So Georgia's going to be tested this year for
Well,
sure.
so let me ask you, what would it take, in your opinion, for an 8-4 SEC team with a schedule like Florida or Georgia to make its way into the playoff?
Yeah, you obviously need some help, right? You need the Big Ten to beat up on each other a little bit. You need that in Oregon, maybe a three-loss Oregon team loses that last game of the season type of thing, or even a three-loss team is sitting there, but their schedule, Penn State doesn't play Ohio State, or you know, I don't know what Penn State's schedule is off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure they miss like Ohio State and USC, for example, but you'd have to get where the head to head is just undeniable that that schedule is so much stronger in favor. Let's say it is the Gators, right? In favor of the Gators. I do think 8-4, you can make a strong argument though for Florida with this schedule this year. I do think that three losses though, you're almost safe to get in with 12, which I don't think is going to be necessarily the case if you're a Big Ten team with three losses. I do think with Florida's schedule, that's the unique scenario. Three losses, I think they're 100% in. But I do think with that fourth loss, you get a little bit of help at the end of the season. I think you can make that happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about it. This might actually make the non-conference rivalry games at the end of the season the critical ones, right? Where all of a sudden now, let's say a team that makes the SEC championship like Georgia, but now has a game against Georgia Tech,
Mm-hmm.
right? They've qualified for the SEC championship game, but you got the game against Georgia Tech, and let's say they end up blowing that game. Well, now does that give another team an opportunity to maybe hop in front of them if they then lose the SEC championship game the next week? Those sorts of things maybe become important. So Florida's got that Florida State game. Obviously, that one can go either way. And you got a bunch of those rivalry games. You were just talking about Ole Miss. This is what made me think about it. If they lost to a bad Mississippi State team in the Egg Bowl, like, do you put an 8-4 Florida team that's surging in front of a 9-3 Ole Miss team? If Florida just beat them head to head, they
Yeah,
lost the Egg Bowl, and all of a sudden, yeah, they're 9-3, but they look like crap, and Florida just beat them.
right.
Like, how
Just
does how do you gauge
Well, does
that
Florida
given the
go to
schedule Florida had to
Austin
play?
and battle that Texas team down to the wire? Do they give Georgia a competitive game? And there'd have to be some of that going on too in the schedule. So, and one of those four losses cannot be, you can't be Mississippi State or UCF. It can't be on that. But man, UCF, as much as everybody's talking about the Miami game, would it be a worse game to lose than UCF this year?
No,
I
we'd never
don't.
hear the end of it.
Yeah, those guys would be brutal, man. I don't know. I think you got that's the one that's really you want to really have a miserable time, lose that game. Jeez. That's like a no-win game playing those guys. I don't enjoy the feeling. I just hope we crush them. That's the one. Let's bury them and put an end to that talk. All
Um,
right.
so I'm always going to say Georgia and Florida State. I'll take a loss to Central if we get if we get wins over Georgia and Florida State. But certainly, I mean, look, I'm not sure there's a game on the schedule this year where I'm like, well, I'm okay with that one being a loss. It's like, nah, like the
I'm
teams
not
that are the
okay with any,
mon.
but I'm saying if you have to ask the question, the one fan base that you really can't hear from, like it's UCS pretty tough. They're pretty tough for a while.
Eh.
But I just want to keep them in their place. I don't need them getting any ideas. All right, let's wrap it up here. We're going on tangents here. We can wrap it up. Will, tell people where they can find the magazine if they
Yep.
haven't
So you
bought
can
it
find
yet.
the magazine at readandreaction.com/MAG. There's a digital option that's cheaper than the hard copy version. There's a link there that'll take you to be able to buy the PDF, or there's a link that'll take you to Amazon. If you just want to search on Amazon or Google, quite honestly, you can type in Read and Reaction Magazine on either the Amazon search function or the Google search function. Should come right up. Like I said, it's a little bit more expensive, but having something in your hands is something people have asked for us. And about 90% of the people who purchased it thus far have decided to go with the hard copy version. And we only had one person who's complained so far about its worthiness. So it sent me a picture with it lining his kitty litter box. And, had he not been so strong in his opinions, we probably would have offered him a refund. But now he just gets it for his kitty litter liner, and it was an expensive kitty litter liner.
Well, I think you handled that pretty well. So that was no issue with how you handled
I
that
got a
one.
kick out of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey everybody, have a great week and go Gators. We'll be back. Probably we'll be back after July 4th on that to catch up on things. So looking forward to it. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Stand Up and Holler. If you're interested in more information from me and Nick, you can go over to readandreaction.com. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel here at Read and Reaction, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction to support us, get extra information, and we do Ask Anythings over there every once in a while as well. So check us out. Thanks for listening.